Morning, sir.
Morning.
Good to see you again.
I don't recognize you without your do-rag.
I know, like...
I actually thought it would be a cool idea if AFSP had a do-rag.
Yeah.
And you had hundreds of do-rag wearing advocates descending upon the Capitol, like a biker gang.
I tried that with the team, and I've got a patriotic do-rag with stars and stripes.
Nice.
I've got a camouflage do-rag, and I've got a sort of general psychedelic, depending on my mood. It's called my wild
psychedelic mood.
My West Virginia casual look. But Nicole and the team just didn't buy. Chelsea said if and when I retire, they'll all wear do-rags in my honor. But we'll figure things out. So welcome back. I think this is probably your fourth or fifth visit,
like that.
And for the new, half of the advocates here in the room are the first time to a forum. So why don't you give them sort of a 10,000-foot, what is the National Lifeline? How long has it been around? And what do you see as its strengths? And what do you see as some of the challenges?
So happy to do so. Back in the 20th century, the wizened sage is coming out of me now, but the 20th century we had just a random group of crisis hotlines across the country. A lot of these crisis hotlines, they were really answering their own hotline number. They were not working together. They were not organized in any network. And that meant that there was parts of the country that had no hotline coverage at all. And then some of the hotlines that were in existence didn't have any backup in the event something happened to them. There was a surge in calls or something like that. So now in the 21st century, since the network started, since the federal government started funding the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, it's now an organized collective, a network of local crisis centers. Right now, 170 locally operated and financed crisis centers. And right now there's, again, 170 in that national network. About 48 states are contributing crisis centers to the network. That doesn't mean that the other two states aren't covered. That's the beauty of the national network, because now you can phone anywhere at any time from any part of this country, and you can get someone to pick up that phone, regardless of whether you're standing at a lake at 3 in the morning or you're at a home in New York City. So this allows us to have not only local coverage, but backup coverage. So if a center is either unavailable or not in your area, it will go to a national backup center to make sure that all calls are answered.
Excellent. So how many calls a year do you now answer, roughly?
Well, let's see. The first 12 years, from 2005 to 2017, we answered about 12 million calls. And in the next 4 years, we expect to answer another 12 million calls.
Wow.
So about 15% increase in calls every year. Last year, about 2.2 million calls were answered. Probably about 2.5 million will be answered this year.
Astounding, astounding. So I know that if you call the Lifeline and you are a veteran, you can hit 1 and you're transferred immediately to a peer counselor.
Well, not a peer, but a Veterans Crisis Line operator. Some of them are veterans.
Okay, but they've been trained to work with veterans and their particular issues. So can you talk about that program and how it relates to the civilian and perhaps some of the funding issues, that the contrast?
In 2007, the VA was missioned with the task of setting up its own crisis line for veterans due to the high risk of suicide for that population. And they could have said, we'll just have our own crisis line. But they wisely noted that we should have one crisis number for all Americans. And so in so doing, we're all sharing the 1-800-273-8255 number. And so when you call that number, there's an automated greeting that greets the caller and gives them the option of pressing 1 if they're a veteran or a member of military service or concerned about 1. And so when you push that 1, it then routes you over to one of 3 VCL or VA-operated centers. And they're in Canandaigua, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia, as well as Topeka, Kansas. And they got about a third of the calls that were dialed into 800-273-8255 last year, about between 650,000 to 700,000 calls. And you don't have to press 1 to still get help. I mean, it will, if you're a veteran, you can choose not to speak with the VA.
Right.
And some people choose not to. They want the local help in their local area. There's also, through our collective of 170 centers, they all operate their own local lines too. So veterans will call into those lines. So between our 200,000 veterans that we will also answer calls for in the national network, and the VCL answering about 650,000 to 700,000, we're close to 1 million veterans are being served through this national network.
Cool. So I think and I meant to bring one just for show and tell, I got it in my binder. I think your team helped prepare green sheets that are in the folders that are state-centric, which lay out both the 10,000, right there, I see that, yep, right there. The sheet, the front cover is green. So tell us about that sheet and why it was put together, and what are some of the most important messages on there as our advocates go to the Hill tomorrow. And later today, this is a lightning round right now, John is going to be doing a more detailed focus session. So we're going to talk for everybody right now, and then later today you can come to a more detailed session. But give everybody a sense of why we asked you to put that
together.
Well,
a lot of people, when they think about the National Lifeline, imagine it's just one center in New York City or DC that's answering all the calls, similar to like the Veterans Crisis Line. They don't understand that when people are calling from Texas, those calls are routed to a local center in Texas, not someplace in DC. So when state and local officials advertise the Lifeline, when some of you are advertising the Lifeline, you may not be aware that those calls are supposed to be answered locally. And the reason for that is that if local centers are responding to the calls, they're more likely to know about local resources, including crisis and emergency resources. So it enables more efficient connection to those local resources. So that's the idea. And we also know that suicide prevention should be happening locally. It happens in your homes and in your communities. So the closer that we can bring our best practices through our crisis centers into your community, the better. So our local centers need to be funded. What you'll see there is that in a number of states, those calls are not sufficiently funded, or the centers are not sufficiently funded to answer Lifeline calls. About 60% of our Lifeline centers do not receive funding to answer Lifeline calls. They receive funding to answer their local hotlines or otherwise, but they're not, and again, I don't think the funders are aware that there are local callers to this national number that they need to be responsive for and to. Our federal grant is not set up to fund or support local centers answering local Lifeline calls. We do pay for the national chat centers, our national backup centers, the onboarding and growth of our network, and bringing on new centers and making sure that they're practicing the most established care practices for people in suicidal crisis. But for you, as local advocates, it's important for you to know, and this, I think, is a sheet that will act as a guidepost for you. There's something that you can do in working with your local center to make sure that they're properly funded and supported to answer all those local calls. We want to keep those calls as local as possible because it means that calls will be answered more quickly and that they'll get a different kind of local help than they might get at the national level.
Cool. Two things I should have said up front. John's taking a vacation day today, so he's on his own time. So when I ask him questions about funding, he's not on the government time or Vibrance time in New York. So
I'm summering at Camp AFSP.
That's right. So is it correct that the Veterans Crisis Line receives close to $100 million a year to fund their operations? And you touched a little bit on it, but you didn't specifically mention you get about $12 million. We were helpful in this current year. We got the Lifeline an additional $5.5 million.
Yes,
so,
thank you.
And we think in the House, we're going to get you up to $20 million, and the Senate will maybe get you to 25. But just, again, give people a 10,000-foot level, why we think the government has a commitment to the veterans, which sort of can explain that. But what more robust funding has to possibly occur?
It's you know, again, it's really understandable that we should be thinking about our veterans just as we think about our kids. You know, I mean, we have a responsibility to our veterans, and we also feel a responsibility for our kids. Veterans have sacrificed for us, and we sacrifice for our kids. So we often think about them first. And while the burden of suicide and suicidal thoughts is huge in that community, the largest burden is actually in the non-veteran community and people who are our age.
Right.
So these are, you know, friends, family, lovers of veterans, of kids. So it's really important that we think about everybody who could be at risk. But I have to say the VCL does it right. I mean, they get paid, they have the right amount of funding to do this very important angel's work. I mean, they are doing they're answering calls within 8 seconds. That's the way it should be.
Right.
These are 911 level responses. That's what people who are in suicidal crisis deserve. Now, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of I guess about 1/8 of that funding. And this, again, is a reminder of what our local crisis centers are taking on. They are taking on a huge number of calls, twice the number of calls is the Press 1 callers for the Veterans Crisis Line. And they're doing this with much less funding, less local funding, less federal funding. And they're doing this because it's their mission. So many of them are stretching themselves and bringing on volunteers and creating their own army to fight this war against suicide. And they do need resources to get that support. So hopefully it's just a matter of time before they're adequately funded and they can do the kind of work that VCL is doing in terms of efficiency.
Okay. As you know, there are groundbreaking discussions with Congress, and actually Congress, for you newbies, Congress a year ago passed something called the Hotline Improvement Act. It passed the Senate unanimously, and it passed the House 369 to 1, okay? So
That one lonely vote.
SAMHSA has now issued their report, and the FCC has it. So why don't you again take a few minutes to tell the group what actually happened and what we're anticipating and what some of the consequences could be depending on what some of the recommendations are.
Well, I'll summarize it by just summarizing some of the things that SAMHSA's report that they filed to the FCC. They recommended having a 3-digit number for mental health and suicidal crises. And again, this is not just for suicidal crises. This is really for anybody with a mental health problem who's in crisis, who needs help now, as well as a person who's suicidal in the moment. And that's truly what's happening with the Lifeline. About 75% of our calls are also people who are in emotional distress. People need a number like this. So what SAMHSA said is the reason that we should have a 3-digit number for mental health and suicidal crises, actually there's a few of them. The first reason was that it's just easier to remember and easier to dial. So if you have a physical or a mental disability, we should make it easier for people. And obviously if you're in crisis, it's really hard to remember or think straight. We need to make it as easy as possible for people to cognitively access their memory banks and say, that's the number. Secondly, if we have more people calling because it's easier to remember and easier to dial, then we should be able to help a lot more people. We expect that within the first 5 years of having a 3-digit number, we should be helping between 12 to 16 million callers. And that's really good news, because right now, more than 13 million people in this country are thinking seriously about suicide every year. We're only scratching the tip of the iceberg right now with the number of people that we're reaching. The third thing is if we're able to reach more people, we can help more people. And right now we know that the Lifeline is effective in reducing emotional distress and suicidality. So if you can imagine 12 to 16 million people getting relief and having their suicidal crises de-escalated. And that's the fourth reason, actually, is that if we can help people, give them an alternative to 911, they'll have another number to call where we're not exhausting either emergency resources such as the police, emergency departments, EMS, so they're free to fight crime and free to deal with medical emergencies in the moment that are real medical emergencies, not just somebody who actually could be treated differently and get the kind of care that they need, which reminds me of the fifth reason, and this is something I mentioned last year about my daughter, who's got her own history of anxiety and depression, and I asked her what she thought about the idea of a 3-digit number, and she thought that it was a great idea. She said, "Dad, I think it would do more than anything to erase the stigma against mental illness in this country, because we have a 3-digit number for medical emergencies. If we had one for psychological emergencies, everyone would know that they're real and that they require a very different response than sending the cops or the ambulance out there. Somebody who will listen."
We're going to have to wrap up, but I want to give you we're going to give you an extra minute or two. You and I have had numerous conversations, and I think the last couple of weeks you brought up a whole notion of this being a social justice issue. So why don't you explain what the group, how and why you came to that conclusion?
It really, it's about what my daughter was saying. I mean, any of us who have been close to someone who's been lost to suicide or has been suicidal or has had a mental health issue, to say that that's the equivalent of a medical emergency or that requires the police or that kind of thinking has led to a lot of persons with mental illness being jailed, who instead could be and should be getting a very different type of care. There's not really a lot of care to be had in jails. We know that a lot of people are carted into emergency departments and put in hospitals who otherwise we could be de-escalating over the phone. 98% of the callers to the Lifeline were able to de-escalate over the phone. Those are people who would not otherwise, they don't have to be transported. They don't have to have the police show up. But that's essentially the way things are operating now. So I believe it is a social justice issue because mental health and suicidal crises disrupt families and communities in a way that certainly physical problems do too. But one could say perhaps even more so because what we struggle with psychologically can last for generations.
Okay, my friend. So this afternoon, there'll be a focus session. You'll also hear about the text line, 741-741. Let's give this man, this is a great American that for years has been championing the Lifeline. So we'll see you later.